Hello, everyone, and welcome to Archaeology. Today is the official 10th video and unofficial 6th video in my series on early U.S. imperial expansion. The subject of today's video is the Choctaw Nation in southern Mississippi prior and up to Indian removal. Okay, so right off the bat, a lot of you in our modern world, especially a lot of you in the modern United States, when you hear the phrase Southern Mississippi, you think of the state of Mississippi as we know it now, seen here on this map. And of course, that is not an invalid way to think about it. After all, especially for those of us in the United States, the state of Mississippi has looked like this for around 150, 60-ish years, give or take. So, I mean, it's basically how we've, the only way we've known it our entire lives. Literally, everyone who is currently alive in the United States and outside of the United States, this is how we've known the state of Mississippi. However, it's not the full picture. It took a variety of different processes, events, and catalysts to get the state of Mississippi to look like it is now. So, in order to better understand how the Mississippi took on its political boundaries, and really how the United States as a whole took on its political boundaries for its states, we need to go back a little bit further in time to get a better look at the larger picture. And that's going to take us all the way back to a time period that is contemporary with medieval Europe, known as the Mississippian period, which of course gets its name from the Mississippian culture. So the Mississippian period begins with the building and construction of the great city of Cahokia. For those of you who saw mine and Bayfeld's myths of the medieval world, or my videos on the Mississippian period, both of which I will have in the iCard, you know that Cahokia was a massive city with a population of around 50,000 people, rivaling that, in fact, exceeding that for much of its history of London in Europe. Uh, and it is this city, this metropolis, where the Mississippian culture originated and would eventually spread throughout the eastern woodlands of the United States. And it would last its height and grandeur as a city would last from around roughly 900 to 1350 CE or AD. But once it got the ball rolling, a variety of different other Mississippian metropolises would also rise, such as the city of Moundville, which was constructed and lived in by the ancestors of the Choctaw people. And its height and grandeur, the height of its grandeur, lasted roughly from 1000 to 1450 CE or AD. So pretty contemporary with, if not only slightly after, the construction of the city of Cahokia. And it didn't stop there because, of course, much like Cahokia, eventually Moundville would also decline about 100 years after Cahokia did. But the ancestors of the Choctaw people would just go on and construct a new city, albeit a smaller city than Moundville, and that would be the city of Tuscaloosa, where they would live from 1450 to somewhere in the 1540s CE or AD. And the city of Tuscaloosa was part of what was known as the Tuscaloosa Chiefdom, which you can see here. However, eventually their decline, much like their predecessor Moundville, would come. But unlike their predecessor Moundville, but excuse me, Tuscaloosa's decline, also known as Mabila, as it was called by the Spanish, would come at the hands of the conquistador Hernando de Soto in his expeditions through the what would eventually become the southeastern portion of the United States, where he would eventually come across the city of Tuscaloosa or Mabila, um, and would proceed to attack and eventually defeat the chiefdom of Tuscaloosa in the so-called Battle of Mabila, albeit um, not before facing stiff resistance from the ancestors of the Choctaw. In fact, as you can see in this little transcript from the DeSoto Chronicles themselves, um, DeSoto's forces actually almost lost the battle, being pushed back and pushed out of the city of Tuscaloosa of Mabila multiple times, and in fact, suffering heavy casualties. And as you can see here in this excerpt right here, the only reason that they were able to succeed, that the conquistadors were able to win the battle, is that they uh, essentially initiated one last sort of assault on Mabila and started setting the buildings on fire, which in essence caused chaos throughout the city and essentially helped the conquistadors win the day. Um, but again, it's important to note that this was really not necessarily a foregone conclusion uh, until the setting on fire of buildings. Now that brings us to our next section, the Choctaw Nation itself. So after the collapse of the Tuscaloosa chiefdom, maybe not necessarily right after the Battle of Mavila, but maybe a few years after, um, the Tuscaloosa chiefdom would collapse, uh, and would eventually lead to the rise of the Choctaw Nation, uh, from a combination of peoples, including but not limited to the Pensacola culture you see here on the left, from what is now modern day Pensacola, Florida, and Mobile, Alabama, as well as the remnants, of course, the remnants of the Moundville chiefdom here, and the Tuscaloosa and Mobile chiefdom, as well as the Plaquemine, or the Cross Creek, also known as the Cross Creek culture here on the right, for on the border of Mississippi and Louisiana. And here is a closer look of the Pensacola culture right there. Eventually, the Choctaw would come into contact with Europeans, specifically the French, when French expeditions led by René Robert Cavelier and Pierre Le Monnier d'Iberville. Um, my pronunciation of French, I do admit, is not the best, led diplomatic relations between the Choctaw Nation and the French Empire. Once this happened, the Choctaw Nation would begin to participate in the fur trade with the French, with, of course, as has been covered in all of the previous videos in this series, with beaver furs being the most sought after pelts during this period of time. And you can see sort of the French trade map here, going all the way down into southern Mississippi and Louisiana. And you can see just the sheer amount of beaver furs being traded to and or harvested by the French Empire during the period from 1600 to 1760 CE or AD. And here's essentially just the New France, as it is called, as it was called during the early years of European colonization. And there is a picture of the American beaver that would have been hunted for its fur during this fur trade. Shortly after, in addition to the fur trade, shortly after the formation of this mutually beneficial trade agreement, uh, the Choctaw Nation would go on to ally with the French to primarily defend against slave raids from Native American nations allied with English colonists in the Carolinas, such as the Chickasaw, who would often conduct raids into territories of other Native American nations, such as the Choctaw, in an attempt to capture rival nations, members of rival nations for the Native American slave trade, which lasted from the roughly the 1690s to 1717 CE. Also, during this time, Scotch-Irish migrants from the British Isles would begin to settle in the American Southeast, including the Choctaw Nation. But this would not be a period without strife for the Choctaw Nation, as a civil war would eventually break out due to trade disputes between the eastern division of the or divisions of the Choctaw Nation and the western divisions of the Choctaw Nation, eventually leading to the pro-French Eastern Division emerging victorious. And this would happen somewhere between 1747 and 1750 CE. And this is a map of one of the French colonies, specifically, I believe, New Orleans. But eventually, despite this victory and this fairly strong alliance, or at least trade agreement with the French would go on to lose what is known as the 7 Years' War, which was a truly global conflict, as you can see on this map. And this would result in the British Empire replacing the French Empire as the primary trading partner of the Choctaw Nation. Because as you can see in this map, all of this became territory that was claimed by the British Empire, albeit it was territory that was at least nominally made or designated as, quote, Indian Reserve after events such as Pontiac's Rebellion and the Anglo-Cherokee War led to the British Empire to pass what is known as the Proclamation of 1763, forbidding, albeit not necessarily effectively, in fact, ineffectively would probably be the best term, ineffectively forbidding British colonists from settling west of the Appalachian Mountains. And now this brings us to our next section, and one of the biggest sections in the video, the Choctaw Nation in the United States of America. Specifically starting with the warfare between the Choctaw Nation and the United States. And this warfare would really begin with the outbreak of the American Revolution, where the Choctaw Nation would side with the British, with roughly 1,000 Choctaw warriors fighting alongside British soldiers against the Spanish Empire and the Continental Army. Though it is important to note that there were much, much smaller numbers of Choctaw who independently went and served as scouts for the Continental Army. But again, while that happened, the Choctaw Nation itself, the majority of the Choctaw Nation itself, sided with the British during this conflict. And during and after this conflict, the Choctaw Nation would also go on to fight alongside the Cherokee war chief Dragon Canoe and his Native American alliance against the United States. That included this alliance including the Muskogee Creek Nation as well as the Shawnee and the Lenape, and various other tribes. But the primary partners were the Shawnee, Lenape, Cherokee, and the Muskogee Creek. While this conflict was going on, George Washington was in the process of developing what is known as, or what he called, a 6-point plan to civilize the Choctaw Nation, and would eventually send Benjamin Hawkins to live among the Choctaw in order to facilitate this plan, specifically sending Benjamin Hawkins, seen here on the right, uh, to the Choctaw Nation in 1785 CE. And of course, here is George Washington. And this would eventually lead to, at least, albeit a temporary one, but it would lead to a peace treaty between the Choctaw Nation and the United States, known as the Treaty of Hopewell, which was signed in 1786 CE. Actually, let me correct myself. It was not temporary, but it was also also was not one that was followed by 100% by the Choctaw up until a certain point. As because, of course, many Choctaw were still fighting alongside Dragon Canoe's Confederation during this period in time. But at the same time, due to the signing of the Treaty of Hopewell in 1786, many Choctaw warriors would also go on to fight alongside the United States against the Northwest Confederacy in battles such as the Battle of Fort Recovery, which actually should be in 1794 CE. All right, so now that we have covered the period of warfare between the United States, now it is time to look at the what are essentially the earliest land cessions from the Choctaw Nation to the United States. So these land cessions first started when several Choctaw chiefs met with Benjamin Hawkins and agreed to cede roughly 3 million acres of their land to the United States in return for peace, as well as financial compensation in what is known as the Treaty of Fort Adams. And this was done in order to appease debtors in the United States. Essentially, it was done to appease people that the Choctaw Nation had a few years before borrowed money from, who were in the United States. And this would actually continue with several Choctaw chiefs, including Pushmahata, where they would meet with United States General James Wilkinson and agree to cede 10,000 more acres of land near the site of Fort Tom Beckby, the Fort of Tom Beckby, in what is known as the Treaty of Fort Confederation on October 17th, 1802 CE. And then just a year later, the Choctaw would cede a further roughly 9,000 acres of land to the United States in the Treaty of Hoboken-Tupa, with the area ceded being in maroon here. And then just 2 years after that, the Choctaw Nation would cede another roughly 400,000 acres of land in the Treaty of Mount Dexter, with both of these treaties being signed in return for the United States paying off more Choctaw debt that was owed actually to British-owned banking firms, with both of these treaties being signed on August 31st, 1803 CE, and on November 16th, 1805 CE, respectively. Okay, so now that we have covered the earliest land cessions between the United States and the Choctaw Nation, it's now time to move on to our next section, the military alliance between the Choctaw Nation and the United States during the War of 1812 CE. Now, of course, as many people, both within and without the United States, outside the United States, are aware, the United States went to war against the British Empire in 1812 CE or AD, and what would eventually become known as the War of 1812, which was a conflict that encompassed basically the entirety of the eastern United States. And during this conflict, as I have already talked about in my video on the Creek War and my videos on the War of 1812, both of which will be in the iCard, the Choctaw Nation, much like the Chickasaw Nation and the Cherokee Nation and part of the Muscogee Creek Nation, would go on to sign a military alliance with the United States and would agree to send warriors led by Pushmahata to help the United States first win what was known as the Creek War at the time, or eventually the First Creek War, where they, alongside the Cherokee, would actually win most of the battles in the Creek War for Andrew Jackson and the United States. And then after the Creek War, Pushmahata would return and would help Andrew Jackson win the Battle of New Orleans. And back again, much like the Creek War, the Choctaw, as well as the French privateers led by Jean Lafitte, would actually be the ones who would win the day for for Andrew Jackson, even though he took credit for it himself. And then after the War of 1812 CE, the United States would send General John Coffee to meet with Choctaw chiefs, including Mushalatubi, at Fort Stevens to attempt to adjust what was essentially seen as a disputed boundary between the Choctaw and Muskogee land. And this is because, as I talked about at the end of the first Creek War video, Andrew Jackson essentially was attempting to take large swaths of Native American land that were not actually part of the Muskogee Creek land, because per the treaty between the Choctaw Nation, the Chickasaw Nation, and the Cherokee Nation, and even the half of the Muskogee Creek Nation that sided with the United States, the only land that the United States was supposed to take control of after the Creek War was land that had been controlled by the half of the Creek Nation that had sided with the British. Of course, Andrew Jackson didn't actually do that. He was trying to take more land than had been agreed upon, which is what led to this treaty. And so eventually, after this discussion between John Coffee and the Choctaw chiefs, such as Mushalatubi, a treaty would result known as the Treaty of Fort Stevens, where 10,000 acres of land would be ceded to the United States in exchange for $6,000 being paid to the Choctaw Nation, with this treaty being signed on October 24th of 1816 CE. And the area that was ceded is in this yellow area here. Now that brings us to our next section, the section where we examine Choctaw society during this period of time. So, Choctaw culture and Choctaw society as a whole was a largely matrilineal society, and I believe it's still a largely matrilineal society. If anyone from the Choctaw Nation is watching, please feel free to correct me if I am wrong. So what a matrilineal society means is kinship is traced through the female line, and a person identifies with their mother's lineage, and property is passed down from the mother's family. And of course, with that in mind, the Choctaw children would be born into their mother's clan and would take their social status from their mother's clan. Choctaw society was also a metro-local society, meaning that when a young couple married, they would go to live with the woman's family. And of course, unsurprisingly, uh, because of this societal structure, women in the Choctaw Nation were the ones who were in charge of agriculture, including planting and harvesting the crops, as well as being the ones who actually owned the agricultural fields. Furthermore, women played very important social roles because they represented a counterbalance to men, um, with women representing refreshment and the refreshment and life-giving aspects of water associated with their work in cultivation, in contrast to the fire and war aspects of men. Meanwhile, men were essentially the ones who were the chiefs and were in charge of warfare and would oversee public ceremonies. Which actually brings us to the next part of Choctaw society and culture, Choctaw warfare. So, in Choctaw society, as well as in the most Native American societies uh, uh, in North America, at least, warfare was a very important way for men to gain social prestige. Warfare consisted mainly of raids and ambushes and was often focused on obtaining captives. Warriors would employ strategies such as hiding in forests during the day and traveling at night. They would attack at daybreak while their enemies slept. They would also even walk in single file lines and attempt to walk in the same footprints in order to confuse enemy warriors or soldiers. Um, essentially so that they wouldn't know how many Choctaw warriors they were potentially facing or fighting. Uh, the Choctaw Nation would also often practice defensive warfare, during which warriors would take lives without killing any women. Um, a an attack on the Choctaw community would mean all able-bodied women would defend the men and women would defend it. Uh, when the Choctaw would capture an enemy, he or she would be displayed as a war trophy. Uh, with all of this said, before war would be declared, a council would have to be held to discuss the matter on whether or not war should be started or conducted, which would last 8 days, or at least roughly 8 days. Often, the Choctaw and other Native American nations in the eastern woodlands would actually, in place of war, substitute a game known as stickball to settle disputes between nations and even between villages. And this was done because of the roughness of stickball. Essentially, stickball is rugby, so not rugby. Yeah, is lacrosse. Sorry, stickball is lacrosse. So if anybody has seen lacrosse games, you know how rough and violent it can get. Uh, and also because of the roughness of stickball, uh, young uh, young Choctaw men and young men from other Native American nations in the Eastern Woodlands would use stickball to train uh, and in the ways of war, and also Choctaw warriors would use it as a way to prepare for imminent wars and raids. And all of these together would lead to stickball being called the little brother of war. So, with that, all that said, you might be wondering, it's like, well, how many warriors could the Choctaw Nation field? How many did they have on hand? Well, that's a little bit difficult to determine, but rough estimates of how many warriors the Choctaw Nation could field range as low as 3,200-ish to as high as 8,000, with generally the most common number being found being the Choctaw could field around 6,000 warriors. And granted, all these numbers come from French contact with them during the 1680s, specifically 1685 CE. But this would have continued. This standard would have continued well into the end of the War of 1812, if not a little bit after. Uh, and furthermore, the Choctaw Nation had a fairly high warrior to general population, non-warriors, regular citizens ratio, with that ratio being roughly 4-1 or 2-1 uh, in favor of the warriors, with a 2-1 ratio of regular citizens to warriors being the highest ratio we can find. And this would be generally comparable for other tribes in the region as well, such as other Native American nations in the region as well, such as the Cherokee and the Muskogee. And I know this doesn't sound high, but it's important to remember for those of you who watched my video on the war with the Northwestern Confederacy, the United States during the period up until the War of 1812 generally only had at most an army of roughly 2 to 3,000 people. Of course, this would change going up to right at the boundary of the War of 1812. But by and large, the United States only up until then only kept around 2 to 3,000 soldiers in the field, ready for war during that period of time. So, with that in mind, this means that the Choctaw Nation was very much a force to be reckoned with, at least for the United States. And here are all of my sources for those numbers. Let's see here. And here is a picture of stickball. And again, you can see it looks very similar to lacrosse because it is the ancestor of lacrosse, because essentially it is lacrosse. Now that we have talked about Choctaw warfare, we need to real quick take a look at what Choctaw warriors and weapons looked like in the 1800s CE or AD. So generally, Choctaw warriors looked something like this. These are actually individuals who are dressing up like Choctaw chiefs, such as I believe this is Pushmahata, but it could also be Mushawatubi. But generally, even though these are chiefs, this is generally what Choctaw warriors would look like to varying degrees. Of course, wearing, they would wear some different shirts and things like that, but this is still a good metric for what they would sort of look like. And the weapons that they wielded were a very diverse set of weapons. Of course, everyone who thinks about Native American warriors, they think about tomahawks. And yes, the Choctaw warriors most certainly did use tomahawks in warfare, but they also had a variety of different war clubs. In fact, in all actuality, tomahawks are just a subset of the weapon war club. These war clubs came in various different shapes. Some looked like this. This is another fairly common war club. It's a war club that has a very large bulb or knot on it that would be used sort of like a mace. There were various other kinds that were shaped sort of like cutlasses or scimitar swords that were called gun stock war clubs, and they would oftentimes they would be shaped like this you see here, and they would oftentimes have one or more metal spikes or blades protruding out of them. And then there were other gunstock war clubs that had no blades on them whatsoever, and then just looked something sort of like this that you see here that would be used just as blunt force trauma weapons. And of course, after contact with Europeans, the Choctaw Nation and Choctaw warriors would begin to use muskets and rifles, as well as pistols, and they would also begin to implement the use of metal knives that you see here. Now, again, as I talked about in my Mississippian culture video that will be in the iCard, it's important to remember that the use of metals, uh, did exist in North America before European contact. However, it was predominantly copper or bronze implements. The use of steel and iron in the eastern woodlands did not begin until after European contact. Okay, now that we've looked at the culture, the culture and uh, societal makeup of the Choctaw Nation, as well as Choctaw warfare and what the Choctaw warriors looked like and what weapons they used, it is now time to look at the government of the Choctaw Nation. So the Choctaw Nation was uh, at the macro level divided into three different territorial divisions, with those divisions being the people of the six towns, the people from the other side, and the people who were widely dispersed. And each of these three territorial divisions would have a grand chief or a principal chief, um, with these chiefs including people such as Mushalatubi and Pushmahata at various points in time. Then below the principal chief or the grand chief of each of these territorial divisions would be the civil or peace chiefs who were in charge of civil duties, and the war chiefs who were in charge of warfare. And below the civil and the civil chiefs and the war chiefs would be junior advisors who would serve under the civil war and grand chiefs as, again, advisors. And then after that, Choctaw men were divided into various hierarchical ranks, which included chiefs, beloved men who were particularly important men, but who were not always chiefs, and warriors, and then below all those, men without experience in warfare or had who had only killed a woman or a child. This hierarchical system was created or utilized in order to keep Choctaw men of lower status in check, since they would follow leaders, or at least it was assumed that they would follow leaders out of respect, which they oftentimes did. However, at times, respect and experience were not enough to demand allegiance. And this was because the power of the high status individuals, such as chiefs and beloved men, would often depend on a system of reciprocity between men of differing ranks, i.e., Choctaw men of lower ranks expected individuals of higher rank to provide them with material goods and opportunities for social advancements and warfare. And the source for that I use for the makeup of the Choctaw government is right here. And here is a graph showing those divisions and the general makeup of the Choctaw government that I was talking about. To explain why this says squirrel chief, that was essentially another way, to my understanding, another way to call peace chiefs or civil chiefs. And of course, connected to the Choctaw government was the the criminal justice system in the Choctaw Nation. So, in the criminal justice system of the Choctaw Nation, murder, things like murder were usually dealt with by revenge, uh, and stolen property was usually punishable by returning the stolen goods or other compensation, with theft eventually later being punishable by a whip. Um, and then also in the Choctaw justice system, things like incest were considered a crime. In order to enforce this criminal justice system, especially after the contact with uh, Europeans and European nations such as the United States, the Choctaw would eventually implement and create a police force known as the Choctaw Light Horse Divisions that were given the authority to arrest, try, and punish those who broke tribal laws, with this division being created in 1824 CE. And then eventually, in 1827 CE, a Choctaw chief known as Greenwood LaFleur would abolish Choctaw blood law, which dictated rounds of revenge for murders. So, i.e., somebody would be murdered and would lead to the family members or friends of the individual who was murdered uh, going and killing the individual who murdered their friend or family member in revenge, as we see up here and talk about here. And of course, as you can guess, that would lead to a lot of uh, essentially an endless cycle of killing, um, which, and at times was not necessarily that often, but at other times it could be very often. And eventually, that's what would lead Greenwood LaFleur to abolish this act in 1827 CE, with similar abolishments of blood law happening in other Native American nations, such as the such as the Cherokee and the Muskogee nations. And again, here are the sources that I used for that, for this information. And here is a picture of the Choctaw Light Horse Brigade or Division. Now we're going to take a look at what Choctaw towns and villages look like during this period. So, one important thing I do want to point out, far too often, and this is something I've run into as an archaeologist and a historian, far too often people, when they think of hear the word Native American, they think of all Native Americans, period, living in teepees. But of course, that is the farthest thing from the truth. By and large, most Native American societies uh, lived in some form of stationary, sedentary house. Teepees, of course, were a specifically Great Plains mode of living and had a very specific purpose and reason that it was designed. So, with that in mind, it's important to remember that the Choctaw, again, like I said, like most Native American nations and Native American peoples, did not live in teepees. They lived in either stucco or wattle and daub houses, like you see here, or they lived in log cabins. And that's generally what traditional Choctaw villages or towns looked like. And eventually, by the 1800s CE, log cabins, especially in the European and American style, would take prominence and would be the preferred house to live in by the Choctaw Nation, by members of the Choctaw Nation. Though again, remember, they always lived in some form of log cabin to a certain degree. Also, by the 1800s, Choctaw towns and villages began to adopt American buildings such as blacksmiths, taverns, and American style, United States style schoolhouses, as you see here and here. Okay, so now that we have looked at the traditional homes and villages of the Choctaw Nation, both before and during contact with the United States, we now need to look at the economy of the Choctaw Nation. So, starting off, uh, we need to look at the agricultural economy or the food economy of the Choctaw Nation. So, women in the Choctaw Nation would be in charge of the agricultural economy, which was based on the cultivation of crops such as corn, beans, and squash, oftentimes called the Three Sisters by Native American nations in the Eastern Woodlands. But it wasn't just focused on that. Women would also go out and collect and harvest wild plants such as blackberries, plums, and hickory nuts, while the men would go out and hunt animals such as deer and wild turkey and would fish for various different types of fish. Then, after contact with Europeans, the Choctaw Nation would actually begin to develop and adopt a cattle economy, which would first happen after the Choctaw Nation adopted cattle raising from the French sometime in the 1690s CE, eventually leading to cattle raising becoming an important part of the Choctaw economy in the 1730s CE. And eventually, this in itself would eventually lead to the Choctaw to begin to use land that was previously reserved for hunting and warfare is grazing lands for cattle in the 1770s CE. In fact, the cattle economy the cattle rearing and raising became so important to the Choctaw economy after the signing of the Treaty of Hopewell, where Choctaw warriors would begin to replace warfare with cattle raiding, where essentially they would raid European settlements to gain more cattle, which again in itself shows just how important the cattle economy had become for the Choctaw Nation. In fact, this cattle raiding became so frequent and so important to Choctaw culture that young men began to adopt names such as cow killer. And then to eventually, with all of this happening, by the 1820s CE, the Choctaw Nation had roughly 43,000 cattle at 2.07 cattle per capita, valued at $400,000 on the hoof, or $500,000, or $500 after slaughter. $500,000 after slaughter, which was very comparable to European and American, the European and American cattle economies. And here is the source that I used for these numbers. Another aspect of the Choctaw economy that began after contact with Europeans in the United States was the Choctaw adoption of European plantation farming and, of course, African chattel slavery. This was something that was adopted by the so-called 5 civilized tribes of the Southeast, those being the Choctaw, as well as the Chickasaw, Muscogee Creek, Cherokee, and Seminole. And with the adoption of this economy, cotton would help essentially help the Choctaw Nation flourish, albeit to a lesser degree compared to the cattle economy, and would eventually lead to the construction of several large-scale plantations in the Choctaw Nation by wealthy Choctaw, as seen here. One thing that I do want to drive home, one thing that I think is absolutely important to mention: the treatment of enslaved Africans in the Choctaw Nation was most certainly as horrible and as brutal as it was in the United States. Another thing that I have heard before as a historian and archaeologist, uh, especially when I worked um, in museums involved with Native American nations, such as the Cherokee and the Choctaw, was that was an idea that somehow uh, enslaved African Americans were treated um, better or more leniently by Native American nations, such as the Choctaw and the Cherokee and the Muskogee Creek and such. That is absolutely not true. Like I said just a couple of minutes ago, the treatment of enslaved African Americans in the Choctaw Nation, as well as in other Native American nations, such as the Cherokee and the Muskogee Creek Nation, was every bit as brutal as it was in the United States and in European nations. If there's absolutely nothing else that you take away from the slide, it has to be that. And you can see this right here with the treatment of the Choctaw slaves, of the enslaved African Americans in the Choctaw Nation. Because again, if there is anything that you take away from the slide, it has to be this. This is a picture of an enslaved African American from a United States plantation, but showing all of the scarring from the whipping and lashings that he would receive as punishment for the minorest infractions, sometimes no infractions. Um, and that would most certainly happen again in the Choctaw Nation. So while this picture is from a plantation within the United States, this is most certainly a scene that you would have seen on plantations in the Choctaw Nation. Now it's time to look at our next section, Christianity in the Choctaw Nation during the 1800s. So, Christianity really began to spread into the Choctaw Nation right around 1810 CE, when missionaries from the United States began to enter the Choctaw Nation, with most of these missionaries consisting of Presbyterians from New England. Missionaries, once they're the missionaries, would begin to build missions and schools, such as the Choctaw Academy, hoping to convert young Choctaw citizens. However, while the academies had very minor success in converting students, most Choctaw were only interested in the education the schools provided for their children, such as education in traditional Choctaw practices, as well as education and practices from the United States, um, so including reading the English language and teaching uh, American United States arithmetic, teaching them trades such as carpentry or silversmithing, things like that. Um, and they were interested in the schools because of this education rather than because of the Christian doctrine. Eventually, following their predecessors, the Presbyterians, the Methodist Episcopal Church would also begin to send missionaries into the Choctaw Nation right around 1823 CE. And once they really got their a foothold in the Choctaw Nation, the Methodists would have far more success in converting members of the Choctaw Nation. And they would do this by using camp meetings to facilitate large-scale conversion events, with the largest conversion record being around 1,300 converts who were converted in 1829 CE. Though it is important to note that most of these conversions consisted of Choctaw individuals with mixed Choctaw and white American ancestry, specifically Americans of Scotch-Irish descent. If you remember earlier in the video, the Scotch-Irish migrants had for a long time been migrating and settling in the Choctaw Nation. And here is my source for all of that information. All right, so now that we've covered Choctaw society and culture, the economy and things like that during the before and during the 1800s, now it is time to move on to our next section, the Choctaw and Indian removal. So the sort of building blocks for the Indian removal in the Choctaw Nation would start with further land cessions to the United States by the Choctaw Nation. Um, and this would really these land cessions would really start with many Choctaw who still held on to the traditional Choctaw economy of hunting, who began to migrate out of the Choctaw Nation due to the decline of hunting lands as a result of the rise of the cattle industry, leading these families to eventually migrate west of the Mississippi to places such as Arkansas, or modern day Arkansas, modern day Oklahoma, with this eventually leading to Choctaw leaders such as Pushmahata declaring these migrants as no longer members of the Choctaw Nation. And this would happen in the 1820s CE. That being said, I do have a small caveat to that statement that they were no longer members of the Choctaw Nation, albeit it is my opinion. But I believe that Pushmahata made this claim or made the statement that they were no longer members of the Choctaw Nation because in 1820 CE, Andrew Jackson would attempt to use bribery and use this migration of Choctaw families west of the Mississippi um, as a way to attempt to convince the Choctaw to cede more land to the United States, and to try to convince the rest of the Choctaw Nation to migrate west of the Mississippi also. So this is where that statement from Pushmahata comes that those who had already migrated west of the Mississippi were no longer members of the Choctaw Nation. It was specifically said to Andrew Jackson. So while I cannot personally prove it, and it is my opinion, and members of the Choctaw Nation who are watching may very well have a different opinion uh, than me, and I please leave a comment in the comment section if you do. I would love to hear your thoughts on this. After all, I am not a member of the Choctaw Nation myself in any way, but I believe Pushmahata used this statement just simply as a way to tell Andrew Jackson no. Uh, I personally don't think he actually believed it. Again, if members of the Choctaw Nation may have different opinions on this, again, please leave a comment in the comment section. But uh, that seems to be the context of the conversation, is that Andrew Jackson tried to use this migration as a way to convince or try to persuade or coerce the Choctaw Nation into going west, and the Pushmata was like, no, those aren't Choctaw people. We never did that. Um, something like that. But even though that happened after the bribery and the coercion failed, Andrew Jackson would threaten military invasion of the Choctaw Nation uh, to obtain the land, anyways. And so that threat of military invasion uh, is what eventually led to Pushmahata and various other Choctaw chiefs to signing what is known as the Treaty of Doak's Stand on October 18th of 1820 CE. And the territory that was ceded in that treaty is seen here in the orange. Eventually, just 5 years later, various Choctaw chiefs, specifically the chiefs of the three uh, divisions of the Choctaw Nation, Shunubi, Pushmahata, and Mushawatui, would go to Washington D.C. in an attempt to convince the United States to expel settlers who were squatting in Choctaw land, or at the very least, get the United States to pay some form of financial compensation to the Choctaw Nation for the loss of the use of their lands. Eventually, and they would do this, they would go to Washington and meet with President James Monroe, and this would eventually result in the cession of all Choctaw lands in Arkansas in the Treaty of Washington City, and would also result in the death of Pushmahata, who would die of a respiratory disease that, based off of the description, many modern doctors over the past few decades and modern historians over the past few decades have identified very tentatively as croup. And here is Mutual to the there is President James Monroe, and here is the territory that was ceded from Arkansas to the United States by the Choctaw Nation. And here are the terms of the Treaty of Fort Washington itself, which included things like, of course, the land ceded to the United States. One of the sort of subfields of the treaty was that the Choctaw were to be paid $6,000 annually forever, as well as paid $6,000 to them annually for 16 years. In addition to the $6,000 that they were to be paid annually, the Choctaw were to be given provisions for Choctaws who may desire to remain in the territory that had been relinquished. Certain debts that were due by the Choctaws to the United States would be relinquished. The Choctaw Nation would be paid for services rendered in various campaigns, such as the Pensacola campaign in the War of 1812. Payment to satisfy claims were due by the United States. Another article of the treaty was modified that the Congress of the United States shall not exercise the power of apportioning the lands and bringing them under the laws of the United States without the consent of the Choctaw Nation. They would send an agent and a blacksmith for Choctaws west of the Mississippi. An individual by the name of Robert Cole received a medal for his service. The friendship between the Choctaw Nation and the United States was perpetuated as signed by the treaty. And of course, the treaty, unsurprisingly, had a specific article determining or stating when the treaty would take effect. But of course, that would not be the end of Choctaw land cessions to the United States. Which brings us to our next section, Andrew Jackson, the Choctaw Nation, and the Indian Removal Act. So, in 1828 CE, Andrew Jackson would be elected President of the United States. And shortly after that, in the Choctaw Nation, Greenwood LaFleur, the individual who had abolished Choctaw blood law just 3 years prior, would be elected as principal chief of the Choctaw Nation, or at least of one of the divisions of the Choctaw Nation, and would be put in charge of negotiating with the U.S. government on the behalf of the Choctaw Nation. And he would be elected on March 15th, 1830 CE. But despite his election, Greenwood LaFleur's election, and his attempts to negotiate with the United States on behalf of the Choctaw Nation, Andrew Jackson's Indian Removal Act was passed by a narrow vote of 28 to 19 in the Senate and 101 to 97 in the House of Representatives on April 24th, 1830 CE. And it's important to note, as you can see here in this narrow vote, this was by no means a what universally agreed upon or universally popular bill. but it was a bill that Andrew Jackson had been trying to pass for years nonetheless, and had succeeded. So, with the passing of the Indian Removal Act and facing migration west of the Mississippi or submission uh, to the U.S. and state law as citizens, the Choctaw Nation would eventually sign what is known as the Treaty of Dancing Rabbit Creek on February 24th, 1831 CE, with the terms of the treaty including articles such as perpetual peace and friendship between the Choctaw Nation and the United States. The Choctaw Nation would be conveyed lands in what is now Oklahoma, west of the Mississippi River. Lands east of the Mississippi River would be ceded, and removal would begin in 1831 CE and end in 1833 CE. The Choctaw Nation would retain its autonomy and its independence in Oklahoma, with descendants being secured from the laws of U.S. states and territories forever. Another article of the treaty would be that the U.S. would serve as a protectorate of the Choctaw Nation. Choctaw Party or parties of Choctaws part of violent acts against the United States and the United States citizens, and as well as the United States property, would be delivered to U.S. authorities. Offenses against Choctaw individuals and their property by U.S. citizens and other tribes would be examined and every possible degree of justice applied. The Choctaw Nation would be bound to agree to no harboring of U.S. fugitives, with all expenses to capture him or her paid by the United States. There would be individuals who would be ordered from the Choctaw Nation. Traders required a written permit to trade between the Choctaw Nation and the United States. Navigable streams would be free for the Choctaw Nation, with U.S. post offices being established in the Choctaw Nation, and U.S. military posts and roads would also be created. Intruders would, by the articles of this treaty, also be removed from the Choctaw Nation. U.S. citizens stealing property from the Choctaw Nation shall be returned, and the offender punished under United States law. Choctaws offending United States laws should be given a fair and impartial trial. And here are the terms of the treaty continued, with a U.S. agent by the terms of the treaty being appointed to the Choctaw Nation every 4 years. Choctaw individuals may become U.S. citizens and are entitled to 640 acres of land in Mississippi, with additional land for children, i.e., if Choctaw individuals stayed in Mississippi, they could only do so if they became a citizen of the United States. Lands were also granted to Choctaw chiefs such as Greenwood LaFleur, Mushel among others, with annuities granted to each of them. Transportation and wagons and steamboats would be provided at the cost of the U.S., along with ample food which was supposed to be provided during removal and 12 months after reaching the new homes in Oklahoma Territory, Indian Territory, as it was called. Also, reimbursements would be provided for cattle left in the Mississippi Territory. Annuities to the Choctaws would continue from other treaties, in addition to payments after removal. The Choctaw country, the nation of the Choctaw Nation, country of the Choctaw Nation would be surveyed. Lands were granted to I. Garland, Colonel Robert Cole, among others. There was an article that sought to or declared that it would improve the Choctaw condition with education and as well as provide tools, weapons, and steel. Choctaw warriors who marched and fought in the U.S. Army of General Wayne during the American Revolution and the Northwest Indian War would finally, at least according to the articles of this treaty, receive annuity, and there would be a Choctaw delegate on the floor of the U.S. House of Representatives, at least according to this treaty. Which now brings us to the removal of the Choctaw Nation from Mississippi itself. So, after the signing of the Treaty of Dancing Rabbit Creek, the Choctaw would migrate west of the Mississippi in 3 stages, with 2,500 Choctaw dying on the way and 6,000 staying in Mississippi as United States citizens, and what would eventually become known as the Choctaw Trail of Tears, with this happening between 1831 and 1833 CE. And as those of you watching might have, I would hope at least, realized, this was a period of time, the removal of the Choctaw Nation from Mississippi was a very dark and depressing time period for the Choctaw Nation, the effects of which are still felt to this day. And nothing drives that point home better than a letter written and widely published by Greenwood LaFleur's successor, Principal Chief George W. Harkins, who actually wrote this letter as a farewell letter to the American people before the removals began, with him having written it in December of 1831 CE. So, with that in mind, I ask my viewers to bear with me a little bit as I read the entirety of the George Harkins letter to the American people, because I wholeheartedly believe that in order to best understand the damage and the effects that the Indian Removal Act did to the Choctaw Nation as well as other Native American nations, we need to read primary documents like George W. H. Harkins' letter. So with that, let us begin the letter titled George W. Harkins to the American People. It is with considerable diffidence that I attempt to address the American people, knowing and feeling sensibly my incompetency, and believing that your highly and well-improved minds would not be well entertained to the address of a Choctaw. But having determined to immigrate west of the Mississippi River this fall, I have thought proper in bidding you farewell to make a few remarks expressive of my views and the feelings that actuate me on the subject of our removal. Believing that our all is at stake, and knowing that you readily sympathize with the distress of every country, I confidently throw myself upon your indulgence and ask you to listen patiently. I do not arrogate myself to the prerogative of deciding upon the expediency of the late treaty, yet I feel bound as a Choctaw to give a distinct expression of my feelings on that interesting and to the Choctaws all important subject. We were hedged by two evils. We chose we chose that which we thought the least. Yet we could not recognize the right that the state of Mississippi had assumed to legislate for us. Although the legislature of the state were qualified to make laws for their own citizens, that did not qualify to become lawmakers to a people that were so dissimilar in manners and customs as the Choctaws are to the Mississippians. Admitting that they understood the people, could they remove the mountain of prejudice that has ever obstructed the streams of justice and prevent the salutary influence from reaching my devoted countrymen. We, as Choctaws, rather chose to suffer and be free than live under the degrading influence of laws which our voice could be heard in their formation. Much as the state of Mississippi has wronged us, I cannot find in my heart any other sentiment than an ardent wish for her prosperity and happiness. I could cheerfully hope that those of another age and generation may not feel the effects of those oppressive measures that have been so illiberally, uh, liberally, illiberally dealt out to us, and that peace and happiness may be the reward. Amid the gloom and horrors of the present separation, we are cheered with a hope that ere long we shall reach our destined land, and that nothing short of the basest acts of treachery will ever be able to wrest it from us, and that we may live free. Although our ancestors won freedom on the field of danger and glory, our ancestors owned it as their birthright, and we have had to purchase it from you as the vilest slaves by their freedom. Yet it is said that our present movements are our own voluntary acts. Such is not the case. We found ourselves like a benighted stranger, following false guides until he was surrounded on every side with fire and water. The fire was certain destruction, and a feeble hope was left of him escaping by water. A distant view of the opposite shore encourages the hope. To remain would be inevitable annihilation. Who would hesitate, or who would say that his plunging into the water was his own voluntary act? Painful in the extreme is the mandate of our expulsion. We regret that it should proceed from the mouth of our professed friend, from whom our blood was commingled with that of his bravest warriors on the field of danger and death. But such is the instability of professions. The man who said that he would plant a stake and draw a line around us that never should be passed was the first to say he could not guard the lines, and drew up the stake and wiped out all traces of the line. I will not conceal from you my fears that the present grounds may be removed. I have my foreboding. Who of us can tell after witnessing what has already been done what the next force may be? I ask you in the name of justice for myself and for my unhinged people. Let us alone. We will not harm you. We want rest. We hope in the name of justice that another outrage may never be committed against us, and that we may further be cared for as children and not driven about as beasts, which are benefited by a change of pasture. Taking an example from the American government and knowing the happiness which its citizens enjoy under the influence of mild Republican institutions, it is the intention of our countrymen to form a government assimilated to that of our white brethren in the United States, as nearly as their condition will permit. We know that in order to protect the rights and secure the liberties of the people, no government approximates so nearly the perfection as the one to which we have alluded. As east of the Mississippi we have been friends, so west we shall cherish the same feelings with additional fervor. Although we may be removed to the desert, still we shall look with fond regard upon those who have promised us their protection. Let the feeling be reciprocated. Friends, my attachment to my native land was strong. The cord is now broken, and we must go forth as wanderers in a strange land. I must go, and let me entreat you to regard us with feelings of kindness. And when the hand of oppression is stretched out against us, let me hope that a waning voice may be heard from every part, a warning voice may be heard from every part of the United States, filling the mountains and valleys, will echo and say, "Stop! You have no power. We are the sovereign people. Our friends shall not be disturbed. We ask you for nothing that is incompatible with your other duties. We go forth sorrowful, knowing that wrong has been done. Will you extend to us your sympathizing regards until all traces of disagreeable oppositions are obliterated, and we shall have confidences in the professions of our white brethren? Here is the land of our progenitors, and here are their bones. They left them as a sacred deposit, and we have been compelled to venerate its trust, it dear to us. Yet we cannot say, my people is dear to me, but them I must go. Sorry, yet we cannot stay. My people is dear to me, but them I must go. Could I stay and forget them and leave them to struggle alone, unaided, unfriended, and forgotten by our great father? I should then be unworthy of the name Choctaw and be a disgrace to my blood. I must go with them. My destiny is cast among the Choctaw people. If they suffer, so will I. If they prosper, then I will rejoice. Let me again ask you to regard us with feelings of kindness. Yours, with respect, George W. Harkins. As you can see, this was a letter that very much shows the distress and pain that the Choctaw Nation was going through during Indian removal, and shows the feeling of betrayal that many of the Choctaw were facing or feeling at the hands of the United States. Which now brings us to our next section, the aftermath of the removal of the Choctaw Nation from Mississippi. So after its removal from Mississippi, the Choctaw Nation would go on to reform and eventually form an alliance with the Chickasaw Nation in modern-day Oklahoma in 1833 CE. And then, despite the suffering that they themselves faced and were still facing as a result of the Indian Removal Act, midway through the Great Irish Famine, the Choctaw Agency at Fort Smith, Arkansas, raised funds totaling to $170 and proceeded to send it to help starving Irish men, women, and children in 1847 CE. And for those of you who don't know or have very little understanding of what the Great Irish Famine or the Great Potato Famine was, it was essentially it was something that I believe was due to a bacteria, resulted in very, very low, increasingly low potato yields in Ireland, potatoes being the primary food crop of Irish villages and towns, the Irish population. And this in itself resulted in a massive percentage of the Irish population dying as a result. Then eventually after that, essentially as a way to get back at the United States, also in an attempt to defend the institution of slavery, because again, the Choctaw Nation, like the other Native American nations of the American Southeast, had adopted African chattel slavery, sided with the Confederate States of the United States in the American Civil War. And this was Choctaw both in Oklahoma and in Mississippi. Now, I've already done a video on the Civil War where a good section of it focused on, in fact, the large middle section of it focused on the participation of Native Americans in Oklahoma, such as the Choctaw in the Civil War. I will include that in the iCard. But this is still something that's important to bring up because the Choctaw, along with the Cherokee and the Muscogee Creek and others, actually helped the Confederate States of America win several victories during the Civil War, albeit they were more symbolic victories. They were not strategic victories, but they were victories nonetheless. All right, so now that brings us to our last section, the Choctaw today. So the Choctaw Nation still exists in the modern state of Oklahoma, right around here. And despite the past attempts and continued attempts, especially by the Oklahoma state government, to erase Choctaw culture and Native American culture as a whole, the Choctaw Nation has been able to and is still holding on to their cultural practices such as stickball and lacrosse. Lacrosse itself, the modern iteration of stickball, is very popular among all of the tribes of the eastern woodlands today, but stickball in its original form is also practiced today, as you can see here. Uh, so again, despite attempts by the United States to eradicate their culture, the Choctaw Nation has been able to hold onto it, including stickball and their traditional dances. Another thing that needs to be mentioned about the Choctaw today is that Ireland never forgot the kindness showed to them by the Choctaw Nation. And so, in return for this kindness that was showed to them, Ireland erected what is a sculpture known as the Kindred Spirits sculpture. I believe in Dublin, I want to say. And they would also go on to create a scholarship program to allow Choctaw students to travel abroad and study in Ireland, both of which were done in honor of the Choctaw Nation's help. Furthermore, Ireland has also donated to various different Native American nations in the past couple of decades, providing them hundreds of thousands and millions of dollars of aid to Native American nations, such as the Navajo Nation. So I think this is a very important thing to bring up because it's, a very positive thing within the sea of within the very depressing, dark history of recent history of what happened to the Choctaw Nation. And with that, that ends our video on the Choctaw Nation in the 1800s up to Indian removal in early United States imperial expansion. We covered the Choctaw Nation before and after contact with Europeans, as well as the Choctaw Nation's very, very complicated, at the very least, relationship and history with the United States. I hope that, at least in part, you enjoyed this video. I hope you don't. Let me clarify. I hope you don't enjoy it completely. I know that's a little bit of a odd statement for me to say, but given the subject matter of the video, I surely hope you don't enjoy the terrible, terrible, horrible acts that the United States committed and in many ways is still committing against the Choctaw Nation, such as Indian removal. But I do hope that you enjoyed or were at the very least pleased to hear about the positive things, such as the Choctaw cattle autonomy, and especially the continued very close ties of friendship between the Choctaw Nation and the nation of Ireland. So with that, remember to like, share, and subscribe to this video. If you want to see me cover any of the subjects I mentioned in the video in greater detail later on, please feel free to leave a comment in the comment section. And I hope you all have a good day.